before we get started,
Hey, it's Amethyst Virgo. I'm back. We're going through the series again to look at the axis, right? We're looking at opposite sign houses to really understand better how we can improve the ways in which we are allowing ourselves to balance the energy. This is super important for people who have placements in the first and seventh. However, actually, the first and seventh is important for everybody because everybody has an ascendant sign and everyone has a descendant sign. And those are two of the major important points, right? To placements that are non-planetary within the birth chart, just like the IC and the MC are important as well. We dive into the fourth and the 10th. So the first and seventh are super important because they help us understand how we instinctually view the world through our first house and how we relate to others through the seventh house. So before I jump into all of that, as a reminder, if you are on TikTok, follow me on there. I'm there, Amethyst Virgo Astrology, posting some things here and there. So let's go back. So if you missed it, I first started with 6th and 12th house axis, and then I just did the 5th and the 11th house. The important here is that whether there's planets or not, like I said, the ascendant is there, the rising is there, which influences our trajectory through life. Whatever sign is on the cusp of your first house, as I've said probably in my first video where I talked about the ascendant, one of my first videos about this topic, the first house, we're looking at the ascendant. A lot of times you'll hear people say, well, that's the mask. The ascendant, the rising, that's the mask. That's who you are behind the scenes. And I used to think that at first as well when I first really got in depth with astrology beyond sun signs. But as I've done more work and more readings, I actually want to push us further and think about the ascendant and where it is. So on the cusp of the first house, Mars rules the first house. The first house is our body, it's our appearance, it is our identity, it is what we know about ourselves, who we are. Okay. And so it's actually our instinct. Whatever sign is on the cusp of your first house, your ascendant is your instinctual nature. It is the way in which that energy of that sign is how you are navigating through life. And of course, then we look at, the chart ruler. So what planet rules that sign? But it's really important for us to understand the significance there because when we are thinking of our identity, the first house are the things that we are aware of. And of course, we can always sometimes have people with first house energy that you can feel stuck. And I'll get into that in a moment. But I wanted to first start and talk about the importance of that first house. Who you are conscious of being is that first house. Think about it. I sometimes see people confuse the 5th and the 1st. They are both fire houses, right? They are both can be places where we see people really show up. But remember, the 5th house is our abilities. It is our talent. Is our joy. The first house is who we are. Who do we show up as? What do we want people to know about us? Right? What are the ways in which we navigate the world? So when we think of this, remember the first house is the house before the second house of money, which is what we obtain. But we need a sense of self first. Who are we? The first, now, when we talk about the 7th house, though, it is who we are attracting, who we are attracted to, who we are engaging with, the people that help us understand relationships. That descendant sign is very important. It is how we move and respond to life. The planets, the aspects show how we benefit from this instinct or what challenges we may have. So think about the challenges. If you're a person that has Saturn in retrograde, and then you have Venus in your 7th house, well, you're going to experience Venus is natural to the 7th house, so it's going to dominate a little bit, right? Because that Venus energy feels at home there. And you might have really good relationships with people. Or you might be a relationships person. You're always in a relationship, or people are just drawn to you, but you don't know who you are. And so that 1st and 7th house energy, if you want to look at it before I dive into the 7th a little bit more, think of 1st and 7th house energy as like when a person has been married for several years, 20 years maybe, and everyone's like, oh my gosh, they look like the perfect couple. They seem so happy. Like, what's going on? And then that person's like, I'm not happy. I don't want to be in this marriage anymore. I want to go, be myself. That is a first house experience. So that person could be going through a first house transit. That person could have a first house planet that was in retrograde and now they've worked on that planet. That person could have a North Node in the first house and they're finally tapping into it. That person can have a progressed planet going through their first house where now all of a sudden in their progressed chart, they have a first house placement for the first time in their life. And so there we have, and again, you always are going to have transits go through your first house, but progressed charts, as we know, it's a little bit more stationary, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds with that. But think about that. That is what we're thinking of when we think of the 1st and the 7th house. Are you people person, or are you a very independent person. Too much first house energy, you can be really self-absorbed. It can be all about you, right? Too much first, you're relying on self instead of experiences with other people, right? You know who you are. You force your, maybe you force your presence on people. If you have a really like Mars conjunct Pluto in that first house, if you've sat in that first house, you find yourself really important. And you've Sun in the first house, right? You're used to showing up. You're used to people being drawn to you. But you might be a person where like people, you're popular, or people know who you are, good or bad. But you struggle in seventh house. You struggle to really relate to people. People know who you are, but they don't really want to have a partnership with you, or you struggle in that area. Even without romance, we could talk about the seventh house is also business. You know, if you find that you're always trying to have a business partner and it always fails, look at what's happening in your seventh house. Of course, so we talk about the ascendant. The descendant sign is across from the ascendant. I have a video where I go more in depth about ascendants and descendants. Okay, but the seventh house is other people, relationships, who we are in relationships. Who do we show up as? We look at the seventh house. Who are we attracting? Or what are the themes of our relationships? Who are the people we're supposed to learn relationships with? What conflicts may emerge with the seventh house? Because remember, the seventh house is also the house of open enemies. Think about that. Secret enemies, 12th house. Open enemies and secret enemies are more of a traditional, like an older type of theory. But think about open enemies. I always say the seventh house can be perceived as, with open enemies, is who challenges you. And not necessarily these people are your enemy. They could be. Who challenges you? And think about relationships to the seventh house. How do some of you get intertwined with people who you think are good for you but aren't? Again, everything I'm saying is going to rely on your birth chart, going in depth and understanding, but this is conjunct this, and this is square this, and this is opposing this, but I also have this here, and I have this in this house and this house. Again, birth chart readings will help you really dissect your individual, approach to that. But it's very important to understand the balance here that needs to happen, because that first house is Mars itself. We need that Mars. We need to act on our own behalf. We need to show up for ourselves, Mars. But the seventh house, most people do find it important in life to find somebody to relate to, someone to partner with. It does not always have to be romantic, right? You can see people who just really value one-to-one relationships with their seventh house, okay? But when we think of this, we also have to understand the importance of what energy is there. Because when we have seventh house energy and it's unbalanced, we then become so intertwined with our relationships, we forget to work on ourselves. And then we lose sight of our identity. We lose sight of who we are. And I would argue that that is an important core aspect of everyone's experience here on Earth for most people, is this assertion of who am I? How do I present myself? Am I confident in my identity? Because a person who's not confident in their identity could have retrograde planets in the first house. And so it's easier to rely on relationships. You have a sun in the seventh house. Remember, the sun is in detriment when it's in Libra. Therefore, when the sun, which is self, is core vitality, is in the parts of partnership, people can over rely on that sun. You over rely on that energy. You over rely on those relationships, right? And then it can sometimes, if people have very intense planets in the seventh house, it can be possessive. There can be possessive themes. Pluto, Mars, possessiveness, control, or Jupiter, Venus. You can have some of the more benefic planets, but you're always in a relationship. You can't be alone. You don't know who you are without a relationship. And you can argue that some people are better with someone else, right? There could be people where there are people who bring out the best in you. That is definitely possible, right? But remember, we're thinking relationships. Who are we in the relationship? The energy that we have changes when we're with other people. But yes, we might say, I know who I am, right? All of us might believe we know who we are. But it's true. When we are in a partnership, relationship, friendship, energy comes together, and sometimes it alters the way in which we show up. Doesn't mean you're fake, but it means we draw for people. Like I said, some people bring out the best in us, some people bring out the worst. If you're finding your seventh house like, whoa, people keep bringing out the worst in me, you are imbalanced. And you maybe need to go to the first house. You need to work on yourself. You need to work on how you show up, that people think it's okay to control you in relationships, or people think it's okay to ignore what your needs are. Okay. Remember, seventh house also contracts, right? These are agreements, these are partnerships. We are joining up with someone else. But when you have planets that can be difficult there, or you have other elements of the chart that make it a struggle, you can definitely have people who have a codependency type of energy. But if we have first house of who we are, our identity, we can become so self-absorbed that we forget to relate to other people. If a person has a lot, and again, I'm not saying these are bad placements, but again, everything depends on the degree, what the sun is, the rest of your chart, how everything's made up. If a person has a lot of energy in their first house and they think they're really important, you can have, like I said, Saturn people, Pluto people put a lot of pressure on themselves, first house. Saturn is always this need to feel important. And you might be important, right? But it's this need to be seen as important, right? But when you have that with other energy there, it can be an imbalance. Let's say you have a south node of seventh house. No, you have a north node in the seventh house. Let's say north node seventh house, south node in the first house with some planets in that first house. Oh, yeah. So you have some lessons to overcome in terms of identity and who you are and how you show up. But what can happen sometimes is if you overindulge on that, it can become you don't know how to partner. You don't know how to collaborate with people. You think it's all about you. And you know, who we are is important, but being able to relate to people does sometimes require us to understand that our experience is not the only experience. And so when you have a lot of first house energy, it can become my experience is the only one that matters. I'm so involved with who I am that you don't understand that when you're in a partnership, it is about more of that cooperation, collaboration piece, understanding each other. Perspective becomes important. The first house is not about perspective, it's about instinct. It's about instinct, it's about assertion of who you are, and it is about like understanding you. And what can be helpful is some people with first house energy, guess what? That might be what you're here to do. You are here to learn who you are away from people. You are here to learn to have a better sense of self. You might be here with the North Node of first house, and you're here to learn how to do for yourself because you spent all that time in the past life dealing with other people's stuff, seventh house. But there still needs to be a level of balance because when we look at the seventh house and the descendant sign, remember the descendant is the mirror. It is helping us see how we can balance the things that we instinctually do. Everything in life has a duality to it. That is how it functions. That is how nature functions. That is just what it is. Okay. Yes, there are nuances and gray areas. Of course, Virgo, I know that. But, Virgo, there's assumption we always want the right answer, but we do understand there are nuances to things. But the importance of the first house and the seventh house opposition is going to be, especially with the planets, it's going to be the way in which you know and understand when is it best for me to not impose my will or show up in a way in which I am so overly cautious. Again, the person is south node in that first house. I'm so overly cautious of how I show up in the world that I know that I need to be important, but I don't know how to sometimes merge that. How do you merge who you are with the people you want to partner with, the people you want to be in union with, the people you want to be in relationships with? And those connections can form authentically when you sometimes have a person with a Venus in that first house. Let's say Venus in the first house and Mars in the seventh house. So those are opposite planet energies, right? Because Mars rules first, Venus rules seventh. You have Venus in first opposing Mars in seventh. You need to ask yourself something like, do my relationships hold me back? Because you can love Venus in first house person can love themselves and they can be really alluring. Venus in the first house people, alluring, attractive. And that's the person that you're like, oh, they're so good looking, but how come they can't stay in a relationship? Or how come there's always conflict? Well, if you have Mars there, you have to ask yourself that question. Because you could be a self-loving person, but you struggle in relationships. People closest to you may have a hard time with you, right? Because Venus in the first house wants love, it wants what it wants. Right? It wants what it wants, but Mars can bring conflict, it can bring arguments, it can bring dominance, right? In terms of a relationship. And so in that regard, it would be really important for you to understand the ways in which you can utilize that in a more positive way. Mars in the seventh can represent having a better sense and understanding of your influence in a relationship. right? You might be someone that initiates things. You might be someone who initiates. You get things started in a relationship, right? You benefit from maybe being the one who's more like, okay, let's go get up and do this. Let's go do that. Instead of Mars having to be conflict. So you learn how to use that Mars leadership, autonomous energy to guide the relationship in a way where you're still using Mars, but it's not conflict left and right. And with Venus in the first house, you're still utilizing that. You're still aware of the importance of it is that you want in a relationship. Image becomes important to the Venus in the first house person, right? But you don't want to become so image conscious that you forget the importance of having a useful or productive relationship, right? When we think of this opposition and how to balance it, and it's like people who have these placements can constantly feel it's a battle. It's like, and the thing that's really helpful sometimes to do is to understand yourself in relation to things that you want. If you want something and you think that that something is going to be, you need to show up. You have to express who you are, because you could have first house placements and you're on path. You're right. You are, as your identity becomes important in your relationship. So the part of first and seventh house axis, you don't want to, with this opposite energy, you don't want to lose sight of who you are. Bring who you are to the relationship, but also understand in a relationship, you are becoming a union. And it does not mean you have to let a part of you die. It does not mean you have to let a part of you, not be important. But it means you have to have a better sense and understanding of how you are showing up in that relationship and how you are both giving yourself the opportunities to understand who are you together, though. Ask yourself that question. As a relationship, what's your identity? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Most couples have not, right? Who am I? If I'm in this relationship, who are we? Is it a toxic relationship? Is it a cooperative? Is it a productive relationship? Is it a loving relationship? Is it a secretive relationship? Is it a manipulative relationship? Is it an abusive relationship? So just as the first house is identity, there's going to be an identity with the people that you have one-to-one connections with. I always expand the seventh house, okay, a little bit, to one-to-one interactions. These are the ways in which when you're one-to-one with people, this is the type of energy that comes out, that comes up. We think of partnership, people, business, seventh house. If you have a lot of difficult plans in that seventh house, you also can struggle with business, business partners. Feel like you're always getting, you're always getting pushed over, so sometimes you can see within the chart, seventh house. Is this person's seventh house more dedicated to business, partnerships, contracts? But also, we look at the first house as you have to understand yourself first. And I'm not trying to say it's more important than the seventh house, but you must understand yourself. Because if you understand who you are, then you understand what you're offering. Seventh house, we think of Venus. Venus is how we make our money, but it's also the contracts of the business and the associations that we have with other people. So if we're talking about business associations and business partnerships, you sometimes can see who you need to be within that. You might not need to be, I know this sounds crazy, equal partners. Maybe it's you invest in it. You have Pluto in the first house. You have Mars in the first house. You're a person where it's important for your name to be on things. First house, who we are, who we show up as, our identity, right? But you have Neptune in seventh house, or you have, you have Jupiter in seventh house. You make good money from partnerships and contracts, but maybe you don't have to be the person running it, right? So a lot of times when we think of seventh house, we think of partnership and equality. We think equality means it's the same exact thing for each person. Now, you don't want to be in a partnership or business arrangement where you aren't getting fair compensation, but it's also important to understand what you are actually giving to the partnership. A lot of times, first house energy people with very strong placements there can think they're giving more than they are. And so you that's where a lot of conflicts sometimes happen with the seventh house. It's like you're giving more than you would. You're not giving as much as you think you are. And that could also seep into relationships and marriage and things of that nature as well, right? But with your first house, again, I say when you start from the first house, understanding how, but also understanding the parts of your identity that are difficult, the parts of who you are and how you show up in the world that can sometimes be a detriment to how people perceive and take you, right? Take like this idea and understanding of who you are. And some people have a very strong presence. That could be great, but it could be intimidating. and it can influence your relationships. It can be like, why don't I keep relationships? Or why are people so intimidated by me? Or why do I feel like all of my relationships, there's always something someone's hiding from me, right? So it can sometimes be this, it's important to understand yourself first, of course, for the first house. But if you're someone where you have like waiver plants in the seventh house, understanding how those relationships impact the way in which you engage with different types of people can also be key to understanding those things. But through your first house, it's going to be essential to you to get this is who you are by nature. And it's very important to look at your first house placement. It's very important to look at your ascendant and any aspects to the ascendant. It's very important to look at any plants in that first house. How are you showing up for yourself? And in what ways are there things you need to work on? First house of self. We also can have people, if you have any areas of your first house where there's self-conscious energy, self-consciousness, body is the first house. So you can sometimes even see through the first house. It's not, first house is not, I've done charts for people. It's not, oh, first house, they're all confident. They know who they are. Sometimes I've seen people with first house energy and they struggle to assert themselves. They struggle with their voice. They struggle with presenting themselves to the world. But guess what? Because they have plants in that first house, it's a theme. You know how some people may struggle presenting themselves to the world, but they don't have any placements in the first house, so they can kind of get away with not really working on it a little bit, right? When you have placement somewhere, you can't escape it. And it's any house. You can't escape it, and no matter how hard you try. So it's very important through that to know what planets are doing with each other, right? Know the relationship between planets, right? Of course, an opposition in your first and your seventh within a certain amount of degrees is going to be the most contact. Person who has, Saturn at the 29th degree in the first house, and then you have first house, you have Venus at the third degree. It's not making as much of that contact, but you can see contradictions. Wow, this person is so great. Seventh house, wow, people love them. They seem great in their relationship. It's a great partnership, but they don't know who they are. They don't know who they are outside that partnership. They don't know what they represent. This could be, a struggle for some people. You can have some people first house. Oh wow, people they say it like it is. They're strong minded. These people seem very confident. They're known, but they struggle to truly relate and connect to people. And I think we look at the seventh house strictly through a marriage or contract way. I think we also lose the fact that the seventh house is how we relate. And relating to people creates bonds, and it creates connections. And that the more we have in common with someone, that's why I said first house placements, understand that's, and it doesn't mean you have to bond with everybody. A key to this first seventh house thing is also know what's the energy there. What type of people are you most likely to attract? What type of people may challenge you? But also at the same time, we have to understand that, if we come in and we're very dominant and we're very clear on who we are, and that's such an essential part of ourselves is, and some people first house have had to fight for a long time, showing up. First house people, a lot of them have to fight to show up in the world, to, build their confidence and step into a setting and be like, this is who I am, this is me. But the problem sometimes can be you've spent so much time at the first house, and say you have a stellium in the first house, and you have one planet in the seventh house, Neptune maybe. But it can mean that a lot of your relationships you can't see them clearly because you spent so much time working on yourself, which is, we all should do that. But you have energy in your seventh house, and how you can utilize Neptune to not be this nebulous thing, but have it to be something that's a little bit more, it gives you a sense of, connecting to people in meaningful, purposeful, inspirational ways. I do think the first and the seventh house axis is, I think second to 6th and 12th, it's the hardest. It's hard. It's self versus others. It's me. Who am I? What am I doing for myself? What are my instincts? But then we also have to learn how to take the things that we're doing and how do we translate that to the people that are in our lives. And that's where the collaboration comes in. That's where the cooperation comes in. That's where understanding how do we combine the things we both think? How do we combine the things we both think and the things that are important to us in order for us to be a union, to partner up, right? To connect. And some people struggle with that. and for some people it's thematic because you've struggled. There's people, you've had experiences where people have been deceptive, people haven't been honest with you, and so sometimes people are like, that's not safe. My seventh house is not safe. I'm going to work on my first house, and it's about, you could end up with the first house. It's like, okay, you have all that first house energy. You know who you are. You know who you are. You don't need somebody. You don't need anyone to tell you who you are. But you don't know how to connect to people. You don't know, or you struggle with that. Or you feel like a fraud when you try to connect to people, or you feel like relationships are constantly a struggle because you feel like you have to give up a part of who you are. There could be, especially if you feel like your seventh house is stronger than your first house, is bringing people to understand you, integrate who you are in your relationships. If you feel like who you are has to be hidden, and by who you are, it just means the type of person you are, your personality. It could be your identity, your physical identity. It could be, what group you belong to. It could be your racial identity. It could be your gender, whatever it is that is important to you, whatever it is, like a part of who you are, how you show up. Integrating that, right? It's not about hiding, and it's not about, when you are in a relationship, you cease to be who you are. All right, so thanks for listening. I'm next going to do the 4th and 10th house axis. If you have any experiences with the first house and 7th house axis you'd like to share, please drop a comment.